Good evening, everyone, and welcome to the Book Club of California's live online program for Monday, July 12th. It's titled About Auctions, Ups and Downs, Ins and Outs. And it's going to be delivered by Spencer W. Stuart, a collections advisor. We're going to get started in just a moment or so. We have quite a number of people registered for this event. We're going to give them time to enter from the waiting room into the webinar. So we will be getting started shortly. Thanks for your patience. Good evening, everyone. If you've just joined us and you're here for the Book Club of California's live online program titled About Auctions, Ups and Downs, Ins and Outs, well, you're in the right place. We are going to be starting in just a moment or so. We're still letting some folks in from the waiting room. So just sit back, relax, and be patient for a minute. We will be starting in just a moment. Thanks. All right, we're a few minutes past the top of the hour, so I think we'll get started. Good evening, everyone, and welcome to the Book Club of California's live online program titled About Auctions, Ups and Downs, Ins and Outs. This is a live online presentation by writer, lecturer, and collections advisor, Spencer W. Stuart. My name is Kevin Kosick, and I'm the executive director for the Book Club of California, and it's my pleasure to welcome you and host the webinar this evening. Tonight, we have more than 140 people registered for this presentation. So for those of you who are new to us, the Book Club of California is a nonprofit, member and donor supported organization dedicated to preserving and promoting the history of the book and the book arts. Oftentimes, we do that with a focus on the literature and history of California and the West. The book club publishes limited edition books, a scholarly journal, and keepsakes. We also host a year-round series of exhibitions and programs like the one this evening on topics including fine printing, design, typography, bookbinding, collecting, and much, much more. If you're not a member, or if your membership has lapsed and you're interested in what we do, please consider joining our century-long tradition. Our membership dues are modest, but the benefits are many. And we simply cannot do the work that we do without the support of our members. So I encourage you to visit our website at bccbooks.org to join or to donate to the Book Club of California. And now for tonight's program and our presenter. The program is titled About Auctions, Ups and Downs, Ins and Outs. And it is a live online presentation by a writer, lecturer, and collections advisor, Spencer W. Stuart. This presentation is part of our new series of talks for book collectors. Spencer W. Stuart provides advisory services to private collectors as well as institutions, aiding in the design and execution of collection development, management, and deaccession strategies. In concert with his advising, Spencer is an active writer and a lecturer on histories of the printed word for a variety of publications, including The Book Collector and Amphora, as well as the Canadian Broadcasting Corporation. He has an article in the forthcoming issue of Manuscripts on the collecting of authors' born digital writing process, which sounds super interesting to me. And I hope it will be interesting to you too. Tonight, he will be providing a lay of the lockdown auction landscape and the structural impact it will have on rare book and print markets. In light of these changes, Spencer will explore what one should consider when participating in the auction event, either as a consigner or a buyer. If you have questions for our presenter, please use the chat and the Q&A function in Zoom. We should have some time at the end of the hour to take questions, and we'll curate those from the Q&A and the chat. And now it's my great pleasure to introduce Spencer W. Stuart and pass over the controls for tonight's webinar. Spencer, it's all yours.
Great, Kevin. Thank you very much. And thank you, everyone, for tuning in this evening. It's really it's a delight to be able to speak to the club again. You know, as Kevin was mentioning in the initial introduction, when we're talking about auctions tonight, we're specifically thinking about book auctions, print auctions, and photograph auctions as well. So, you know, we can think about the kind of popular image or understanding of auctions when we think of discrete objects such as paintings, sculpture, things of that nature. But what I'm looking at here tonight is really multiples for the most part. There will be some consideration of unique items and how that changes the dynamics, but something to kind of keep in mind from the beginning. To begin with, I'd like to kind of talk about what took place over the last about year and a half when you think about the auction markets and their relationship to the global pandemic. During the rolling lockouts that took place, there was very much situations going on. There were some dynamics in which, you think about the trade. There was certainly a shortage of material that was being offered through the market for collectors and institutions. And also just the whole process itself was completely, upturned. Unless a dealer had a kind of back inventory in which they were starting to catalog materials and offer them through that period of time. But what I noticed with the clients I was working with is that you had collectors that were staying at home. They were sheltering in place in some instances. No longer were they going to be going on trips. They weren't going to be spending money going out for dinners. They had resources available, and they also had time to spend with their collections. They started to, catalog their materials or research their materials further. They started to think about some of the materials that they wanted to add into the collection to enrich the story that they were trying to build. And so what was interesting to note was that there was some transitions that were going on in which, collectors who were maybe in their practice more focused on catalog-centric dealers started to look at the auction market as it was able to transition much more easily than a lot of the trade at that point in time, which, for quite a few within the trade had to do entire shifts of the business model. No longer were fairs a situation. Sourcing of materials during this time were out of the question at points. So there was really a kind of transformation happening. But within that, it was interesting to notice these collectors that were shifting over. And what also happened is, through the researching and dedicated time with collections, the realization of some objectives, some real goals for some collectors. What's interesting to note in light of what I was just mentioning, these scenarios of clients staying at home and working with their collections, is that the numbers also reflect this. What you see here is a spread from about 2016 through to April of 2021 of aggregate results from Rare Book Hub, and these are drawn from roughly 150 auction houses. And what you see here is an increase between April of 2020 and April of 2021. You see a sell-through rate increase of 79% of items at auction to 83%, and the average median of prices at auction going from 2,600 to 3,000. So a $400 jump. Now, what's happening here, right? What's the question? Now, in the scenarios I was talking about, these clients, what happened is that there was a lot of movement over into the auction markets, and they came for the material because it continued to be offered through auction houses, and they really stayed for the process. And so this is something that we'll be talking about tonight, is how value is derived through auction market situations. And so what you see here is a change of kind of fair and catalog-centric collectors migrating over and adding to the dynamic of already a market with collectors, institutions, other dealers who were considering the auctions. So, this is kind of why talk about auctions tonight. One of the major reasons is because through the last year, and it's interesting to see how there have been some shifts in the trade as well. But through the last year, there was a kind of a net new increase in the involvement. And I mean, we're coming into this week with roughly 50 auctions that are going to be taking place in a week, and there were even more during the last couple of weeks. So it's something that's increasing. The technology around it is becoming much easier to stage and facilitate, which will also have some dynamic changes, which we can discuss in the question answer. But this is all to talk about, this experience of a moment in which there's a time dictated offer, within the auction event. So, in a way, you look at this and you think about, okay, these are circumstances that are taking place that are exceptional, but are they structural? And this is a question that we'll be asking for many months and into a couple of years to come. Is there an actual transformation happening? I think in a way there was an acceleration that took place during COVID that was already underway. And so, what was that change? What took place? Within the traditional conception of the auction house, as you think of it to the left here, perhaps, what you see here is a wholesale model. You have a situation in which an estate is being offered almost as a kind of a lump sum in various multiple lots, often to a dealer who then carries it through to collectors, who then ultimately either, as we go through the 19th century into the 20th century, you see these items being positioned within institutions, or they go through trade again. But there's a certain amount of churn and there's a certain amount of change there. And what's happening is that these items are being purchased at a lower price, and they're being moved through the cycle and through the trade. What I think, the situation has been happening for a little while, but I think it was certainly accelerated, was a shift of auction houses to a retail structure. And that very much changes the scenario. I like to sort of look at this one on the left, and if you look closely, some of you on the call may be familiar with this image, but you see here Bernard Courage, one of the Napoleon of booksellers of the 19th century, having a look and seeing what's in this wholesale auction scenario, and where can these items go on into collectors' libraries moving forward. But what you see in the right is an entirely different mentality. And this is, again, as I say, not something that was happening suddenly during the last year and a half, but something that was slowly working. However, made auction houses prepared for the transitions that happened during the introduction of lockdowns. So, particularly after World War II, and this is a conversation that we can have as well in the question and answer, but there's very much a transformation that happened in the mentalities of auction houses as they start to hire specialists who are focused on particular departments. You start to see kind of developments of target marketing scenarios, the introduction of phone bidding, as well as currency converters in the room as live auctions are taking place. You see a kind of broadening that starts to take place. No longer is it just a specific kind of client list, but there are sort of people out there in a global scenario that are being provided the opportunity to take a look at catalogs and consider items, which really changes dynamics. You see the posting of results after sales so that you start to have comparable values of materials being offered. And then also you see the introduction of third-party aggregate websites. So you think of something for visual arts such as Art Price or situations like that, the Art Index. And then you also see within specifically a rare book situation of Rare Book Hub or something of that sort. And so what happens there is you start to see, an access to information and a casting of a broad net. And this really is something that's been taking place, particularly after World War II, moving into this period. It's really another important thing to point out within the context of this shift to a retail model for auction houses is the adopting digital online platforms quite early, which of course during the last year and a half had auction houses in a kind of poised position to really take advantage of net new collectors that were still building their collections, maybe were more focused on catalogs, but then started to migrate over. So, when we go back to this the initial figures that I showed from the top, what you see here, what is this telling us? What's happening here? There's clearly the introduction of net new buyers within this situation, but there's also a stable development of quality offerings, because you see as the median auction prices kind of continue, this very much becomes a place in which opportunities for sellers to offer material to buyers starts to become more appetizing and more lucrative for them to possibly monetize their collections or raise funds to focus on other avenues of their collecting. And so it's interesting, like the clients that I work with, I provide a kind of bi-monthly report, and I'm noticing that a number of the clients are now requesting auction catalogs as well, not specifically trade. And I think one of the things that's happening is seeing auction results, analyzing them, understanding, because again, these are multiples, there's a frequency of appearance of materials. You can start to have a bit of a strategy as to when items are offered and what would be the value of an item, at auction. What would you be comfortable acquiring through that context? So there was very much a conversion that happened. Some of these clients came in slightly skeptical of the situation, mostly because, and we'll talk about this, the risk that buyers take on. But once they got familiar with the process and were able to do the research of the information that was readily available, that mitigates the risk. And it's interesting to note that coming out of the lockdown scenario, and as these collectors come back into fairs and they're starting to take a look at catalogs from dealers that are sourcing fresh material as they're able to facilitate house visits and start to see material again out in the world. What's interesting to note is that there's now much more of a conversation about how value is generated for materials that are offered. And one thing that's important to note, and I think there are going to be more situations like this, is the more recent announcement of Donald Heald to shift to an auction platform. So a trade dealer moving through into this context. And in describing this shift, he says, and I quote, that both buyers and sellers are increasingly expressing a preference for market-derived prices. So there's a shift happening because there's a certain amount of information that's available in that process that makes it for collectors and institutions a more viable option, something that allows them to prepare, something that allows them to see comparables and understand how value is derived from materials. So with that as a kind of snapshot of this period, I mean, these are quite, these are significant increases that we see in these charts. Will they continue? We'll have to keep an eye on it and see. I think it's a conversation that's ongoing, but certainly, Heald and other dealers, I think, are considering these as options. And certainly as third-party auction platforms, Invaluable, other groups such as that are starting to set up, it's going to change the dynamic. And a dealer that considers moving into an auction scenario with inventory that's theirs, this becomes a situation where they can possibly decrease their premiums in the process in that transaction, and could be very much competitive for for a certain share of what was originally the auction house market specifically. So these are transitions. I think keep an eye on them. It's going to be interesting to see, and I think but it's important as a collector and as an institution, really anyone who's acquiring material through this context, is to think about what the scenario is. So if we think about an auction system, right? There is the mechanism, there's the situation of a seller offering material through an auction house who has estimates. They publish their catalogs and they look for prospective buyers. And then there's the event. There is the day. Whether it's a timed auction where there's a couple, several days stretch, or one in which it's opened up and it ascends from there, an English auction setting. There are advantages to this, and then there are certainly aversions, for buyers and sellers. So, in going into the auction system, it is a very different relationship to that of working specifically with a catalog centric or fair centric model of a dealer where there's a relationship established. However, there are also opportunities to source material to build the collection. So if you're thinking about it as a seller, one of the most important things to do is provide yourself the time to do the research, to think about where you would like to offer your materials, through which house, and also the timing. If you have material that, let's say, is connected to some sort of popular event or anniversary around the particular figure or historical event, this can very much, if you're someone who's selling the material, create a certain amount of interest. And through a auction house setting, one which has casts a broader net through kind of marketing online, can very much bring in people who are interested in this material who may not have been previously. So, I think it is important to kind of give yourself that time and that process. Another situation is that you offer the material, you agree on estimates with the auction house, and then goes through the process of being featured in catalogs. So that also takes time. So if it is important that if you're thinking about a kind of larger deaccessioning strategy, that you do very much factor in the timing it takes. Now, what is in the timing? I think one of the more important things is asking yourself, looking at your collection, is to look at comparables, look at similar materials that are appearing at auction. Ask yourself, what region does this reflect? Is this something that's local? Does it have to do with the history of a particular county? Or is this are these materials that are connected with, say, an international art movement or a writer that's known worldwide? This will change where you consider. So think about those regions. Think about the spread that auction houses have within a particular region, either a local, national, or international context. And then on into this discussion of reputation. Investigate the various auction houses. Have a look to see, are they forthcoming with the results of their auctions? That's important. You want to really think about, what would it be like to have the experience of being a buyer through this auction house? Do they mitigate the risk? Do they provide information about the material? How's their cataloging? Have they had experience with materials similar to this before? All of this is important. Are they thinking about kind of inventive ways of discussing the auction and announcing it, either through print or online? These are things that you can start to have a look at. Maybe put the auction house's name through, a Google alert and keep an eye on how they do market their materials. This is all, these are all important pieces of information to see how do they set the stage for the auction event in which your material will be offered. And it's important to think about this idea again and again, that information, readily available information about materials offered through the auction system mitigates the risk and really will attract more buyers and make people more interested in the material. So this moves on into the buyer, of course. This is the other side of the dynamic. And it is one that within the equation takes on all the risk in purchasing this material. And so this is an important thing to keep in mind. However, there is a great deal of information that's available. There's an ability to analyze the material, not only the specific item itself, but how it relates to the actual market, to mitigate this risk and make some informed decisions and purchases that can really build your collection. And you can find material that really aids in the development of your objectives and some of the ideas that you're working with. So as a buyer, I think the most important thing to think about is there's the auction system, as I was talking about. Very much the system is what the seller is interested in. The auction, the buyer is connected in the event, and the event has dynamics to it. The event can be quite overwhelming for some. It can be exciting, but I think it is important before you even engage in it is to know your collection, is to catalog your collection and understand why you're looking at the channel of auction in the first place as a place to acquire material for the story that you're developing. So the collection really has to be the reason that you are participating in the auction mechanism and why you're there on the day. And within that, it's also important to think about what is your financial situation? What are the resources that you're willing to commit to the material or single item that's going to be offered on that day? It might be a scenario. I have clients that have, there's an item that's for offer. They know it to be one that's quite rare in terms of its appearance. They haven't seen it in the trade in a while. And so they're able to justify maybe paying, a little more than the estimate that's posted because it really does fit in the story that they're trying to develop. And so in that case, that's a scenario where, you're willing to pay a little more within the enthusiasm of the auction event to really aid in the development of your collection. So, it's a kind of ends and means justification. But very much the idea of, what does the collection consist of? And then what are the resources you're willing to allocate? That very much should inform the strategy that you approach. One of the risks in not really having a kind of plan involving yourself in an auction event before you engage in one is that you start to think about, well, this is something that I really want in the collection, but you're not really sure and you haven't taken the time to investigate it, and then it's not right. And really at that point, it's the risk that you've taken. But it's important to know the item. So take the time to look at the cataloging, ask the questions of the specialists who are involved in that auction house. They're more than willing and they're very interested in answering those questions. Look back at the moments in which it's been appearing in the past. So know the odds, connect this specific item and its conditions or what have you. How does it connect to the collecting practice that you're interested in? Look back and think about that connection, and then think about, are there other opportunities in the future? That will allow you to make a decision of this event. And really, if it's a rare event or if it's something that will occur again, I think it is important to keep that in mind. And then finally, to know yourself, know how yourself and the importance of the collection connect and intermingle. If it's a scenario where you feel overwhelmed, either in the room or on telephone, maybe absentee bids or possibly someone representing you, think about those situations before you engage. because it is very much a different environment. Now, this is very much a conversation. I think it would be great to open it up to the conversation of the attendees here. But I think that, since April of 2021, the figures that I was showing earlier, there's been somewhat of a change as the world seems to be opening up within the kind of North American context as fairs start to develop again. But very much the collectors that I work with and colleagues that I've been speaking with, this period of time and the engagement with online auctions, with readily available information, with comparables, has really, it's very much shifted the business, and it's very much taking on a larger influence within the process. And so, I think that it's something where I have clients that are, they're really not going back. They're going back in the sense that they're engaging with the trade, but they're also looking on auction. They're looking at that as a viable option. And also I think it's something that is very much you can take advantage of if you are aware of your collection's holdings and how they connect to the objectives that you're trying to achieve, but also if you're analyzing the data that's available to be able to make those informed decisions. So, I think from now, I think we open up to conversations, and I know there's been some questions that have come in, and thank you very much for your attention, and I look forward to the conversation.
I'm back, Spencer.
Hi, Kevin.
I had a whole bunch of pages here of some notes that I was taking, because I have some questions, and there are some questions that are coming up in the Q&A in the chat. So we'll just tell people now is your great opportunity to go do that. Go to the chat, go to the Q&A, post your questions, post your comments. We're going to get to them in a moment. But I'm first going to just thank Spencer for talking about this. It's such a really interesting topic, especially for me, because I actually participated in some online auctions for the first time during the whole pandemic for just the reasons that you mentioned, right? The whole, like, I had time on my hands. I had time with my collection to see what was in there. I had maybe some extra resources since I wasn't going out and eating and shows and things like that. So I thought it was super interesting that you kind of, addressed some of the why. The why is this an important topic, and why are we seeing these changes now? I know there are some questions about, do we think this is a sustainable, permanent change, this switch, this increase? Because as you mentioned, what we saw increases in, what were the two increases in the total number?
Yeah, sell-through rates and median sale rates. And, just to say that the increase in the sell-through rates was, it's often connected to, it's sort of, obviously there was a scarcity of material that was being offered through various markets at that point, but there was also, a quality of material that was being offered as well. It was a combination of people that were deaccessioning materials from their private collections, but there was also process of, there were instances of deaccessioning materials from institutions as well at that time. Materials that may have not been fitting the mandate of institutions that were going towards acquiring materials that were, to develop collections that were more to the mandate of the communities they serve. So, there was that happening as well. Do you want me to? I'll take the screen down and we'll go to split, or what are your thoughts?
But I can leave it up, because people might want to write down your phone or your email or stuff like that. Or you could even go back to the great graphic, which has the buyer on one side and the seller. Yeah, I love that graphic right there, because some people have some questions specifically about kind of the details of how the auctions work, like the buyer and the seller's premiums, like things like that. How are rates, whether the the value and the auction amounts, how are those determined by the buyer, by the seller, by the auction house? Can you talk a little bit about kind of some of those details of the process?
So, you see that, I mean, it's generally thought that traditionally there were premiums that were applied on the buyer side of the scenario. Roughly the 1970s, you start to see a kind of edging that takes place between specifically Christie's and Sotheby's, where they start to introduce seller premiums as well, and these start to increase. The buyer on the buyer side, they're typically fixed, and those are kind of changing as you see, auction houses offering materials, but also online platforms, Katawiki, Invaluable, things of that nature. I encourage you to have a look at the auction house you're engaging with, and they list their premiums, so that they kind of shift. Within a seller context, it can vary. There can be a discretion applied by the specialist or auctioneer if they're in a scenario where they think that this is material that could perhaps make that auction an event or a draw for perhaps future materials. So they may make a decision to lower the seller's premium in order to acquire that material, and have it feature within that scenario. So that very much, that's also somewhat of a variable. I can't really give a kind of hard number on it, but in terms of what its justification was, the scenario of when it was kind of introduced, you started to see, back to this discussion of a shift of auction houses from being wholesale into a retail scenario, is you very much saw, and this is somewhat connected with a particular individual that I encourage people to look into if they haven't, which is a gentleman by the name of Peter Wilson, who started in the 1950s as, he worked his way through Sotheby's all the way to being the head during this kind of ascendance of the international auction house. And there's very much a before Peter Wilson and there's an after. The idea of the auction as an event, photo catalogs, phone bidding, currency converters, this idea of really changing it into a spectacle happens at that point. And while you see, book auctions and print auctions aren't like, say, the Salvator Mundi situation or a Rothko situation, you do see some of the marketing tactics employed by the visual arts departments into the scenario of book sales. You think of something like the first folio that was offered through Christie's over the summer. If you go onto the site, there continues to be material that you can see that really makes it an event. Makes it a once in a lifetime kind of offering. And so when we talk about premiums, these are costs that in theory are going into the creation of the marketing of the material, of making it into an event, but also into having the auction house in a strategic space such as Fifth Avenue or whatever it might be. So there's been very much an increase in premiums, and you have it certainly on the buyer side. When you purchase it, it's it's an extra cost that adds on after the hammer, and so there's that feeling. But there's also, within that context, think about what the auction house offers in terms of catalog descriptions, specialists that are able to provide details, take photographs very specifically of the materials. The fact that there are comparable prices that are listed on third-party aggregators. There's information there that mitigates the risk and allows for people in some cases to purchase material for less than perhaps they would source it on the trade. So, the premiums are, they're sort of something that they fluctuate and change very much. I think some of the larger houses, they've seemed to have inflated them up into the, very much the double digits, the 20s and onward. But I think what we're going to see, and this is something I think this is kind of a discussion that I wanted to get going in this talk, is that the system, the auction system, as we know it through auction houses, is one form of offering. Another scenario is a third-party auction platform in which a, say, dealer has inventory that they want to offer with a kind of estimate range, and they are able to host it on an auction platform for buyers. And that can result in lower premiums because there isn't as much kind of overhead that's being sunk into, it can be a situation where that auction platform online, which doesn't handle the material, think of Katawiki as an example. They're not handling the material. They're kind of working as a conduit or as an agent for facilitating that transaction. And so in that case, you're still working in the auction system. You're still seeing material being offered. You're seeing a bidding relationship where someone is coming in who's maybe a fellow collector, and that's becoming kind of a more of a dialogue. It's more of something where you can see how the value is being derived. And that's where, back to the statement of Donald Heald, traditionally a trade dealer, it's interesting to see him adopting that mechanism. It's one in which the seller can kind of see, can possibly benefit more from it, because there's perhaps less of a markdown when the material is being acquired, and the buyer gets to see where the value is being derived, and it's dictated by a fellow collector. So that's an interesting shift that I'm observing, and it's changing the way clients that I work with are feeling about purchasing materials. So,
yeah, it's changing. And I don't know if you can easily pull up the Q&A from where you are, or the chat, because some of these questions are long questions, and it might be helpful if you read them and kind of respond to them, as opposed to me reading them or trying to summarize them. But I think what you're saying is, like, everybody's behavior and approach is changing in a way. Trade dealers are moving in some ways to online platforms. You mentioned, like, it's more of a retail model, and even in buyers, right, or collectors who are going to some of these auctions are kind of doing that post-pandemic, even though when they can go back to a dealer, right, or they can go into a retail shop, they're still buying online. So behaviors are being changed on kind of both ends of your graphic there, on the seller side and on the buyer side.
Yeah, and something that I'm just finishing up an article and presentation about. This is something that dealers are, the conversations I'm having, people are becoming aware of it. Dealers are becoming aware of it, and it's a viable option at this point in time as well. It changes the way they look at their inventory. The alteration of being a kind of born trade catalog centric dealer is a very particular business model with particular risks taken into it.
Mm-hmm.
Auction is a different model, and is one that might be more favorable or more interesting. It's interesting to note, in talking about this shift of the mentality of auction houses, their hiring of specialists, a lot of them are from the trade, and they've provided the detailed cataloging of material that in some cases was, the criticism of buyers of auction houses. Sometimes they'd say it was cataloged wrong. I think that's happening less, at least from my experience. That's happening less because there is a certain amount of trade that are being involved in it, and there's a particular kind of ethics, a code of practice that is applied to the act of cataloging that's really changing it. So it's not a I don't mean it to be a formulation in which it's auction houses and trade. I think that what's happening is that, and similar to a lot of things taking place through the internet, is that the available information increases interest and it mitigates risk. So you're seeing people who may not have even considered themselves collectors before, who they can look at the market and understand it and be interested in a collecting subject, and they can start to engage in it as well. So I think it's an opportunity, especially as we go into, demographically speaking, a shift where you have collectors who are kind of mature collectors. They have a collection where maybe dealers are not taking it into their inventory, and they can't offer it, say, to an auction house, but maybe an auction system becomes an opportunity, And within that, because it can be marketed digitally and expand to a broad range of audiences, that could be net new collectors, So I think that shift that I was showing before during the COVID period is also a kind of engagement of net new in people involved. I know certainly colleagues were saying there were people that they were not familiar with before who were starting to purchase material and start to engage with collecting, and they were younger people. So I think I think it's something to consider.
So you worked in an auction house.
Yeah.
No surprise. That's how one of the reasons you know so much detail about this. Can you tell us a little bit about the roles in a typical auction house? You mentioned catalogers is one of them. I mean, people I think mostly think of the auctioneer when they think of the auction house, like, oh, that's the auction house. But the reason that there are buyers and sellers premiums, and that's how the auction house makes money, is because they have lots of staff and expenses and overhead and marketers. So can you kind of tell us a little bit about all of that? Because I'm not sure everybody knows about all these behind the scenes people.
The auction, if we're thinking about a traditional auction house scenario, a brick and mortar, you can walk in and make a bid, there's an auctioneer in the room. That there's the auction. The auction takes maybe about roughly 2 hours or something like that, but it's an event. You're thinking about it like an event. So let's say hypothetically an auction's finished, that's all done. You're going on to build a new auction out of nowhere, right? Your past auction had results on particular materials. Certain collectors, say, are interested in deaccessioning their materials, and they see that it appeared through you, and that fetched some interesting results. They start to contact you, and you start to acquire material. You start to put it together and start to see the shape of what the catalog will be. And so you have, and I think this has changed over time. You had strict book auctions in some cases, and now there's kind of multimedia expansion going on where you can purchase first editions of Hemingway, but also you can say purchase his buckskin coat as well. There's a kind of whole gamut of things, but it's all material that you're putting together to make an interesting event, draw people in, right? So you're acquiring material from collectors. You're reaching out to collectors that you already know have material to see if they're now interested in offering it through auction, and you're gathering that together. You ship the materials to a primary location where you start to catalog it, usually with a team of people are engaged in that. You talk about an auctioneer. Very often the auctioneer is also, the head of the book department or someone, so they've got their sleeves rolled up just as much as interns or catalogers, right? And so you are taking, you have a photograph department that's taking photographs of it. You do a layout of the whole catalog. You start to ensure that the catalog is available online, but you also mail it to people that you already have in mind who might be interested in that material. That's that value add for a seller, right? You're providing this material through a mechanism, through a system where there are experts, ideally, who know possible people who'd be interested in buying it, but also interested in perhaps offering it through various networks and publications and media that might draw other people in. It's always this attempt within the auction house to develop new collectors, be interested in the next step. So you're building up, you're kind of getting the word out, right? You're raising it so that when that event happens, you can get the best possible result for the seller and also the auction house, right? And then, in the scenario of the auction house, you've talked to the seller about what their reserves are. So what are they comfortable in terms of setting the low, the lowest possible value that the material can be offered for through auction. So I think that's something that you start to process that after the auction happens. If something sells through, then you might have had someone who is interested in acquiring it who was in the auction, but you couldn't sell it through. That's kind of a negotiation that might happen. There's this discussion of materials being burned at auction. If it appears and it sells through, it's on the record. So you have to let it kind of settle for a little bit. You're not going to offer it at the next auction, because it's already aware, you're at least going to offer it later on, possibly at a lower estimate. So it is important in terms of, as a seller, to think about timing, right? So you're kind of I'm kind of going through the whole process. But,
yeah, that's okay. People want to know the actual process and some of the people involved in it, because you're covering that, which is great.
Yeah. So, I think that then, it's like there's several, I like it. That's why I was kind of using these circles here. They're more cycles, like there's cycles taking place and they're aligning. There might be a situation in which a seller approaches an auction house and says, I've got this material, and the auctioneer might say, we're very interested in consigning it. And they might talk about saying, we've got something also lined up for not this sale, but perhaps the next one. And that's where you can start to think about consolidation of making the auction event really a draw for, say, a very particular amount of material, a particular constellation that are all equivalent, that draws in a particular crowd of collectors that are interested in that material. So, that's that back to that discussion of retail, right? It's that shift of the wholesale, of working as just a discrete mechanism for asset-rich, cash-poor estates at a particular historical time, at a kind of economic transformation in the 19th century, through to where we are now, right? Where we're dealing with individuals, we're dealing with collectors who are trying to form private collections. And I think so it's very much about trying to make that moment an exceptional one, so.
I think participating in an auction, whether the old school in-person auction or online, I think you mentioned it too, there's a level of kind of anxiety in participating in that. And you mentioned, like, you have to have a lot of comfort levels about different things, right? About knowing what you're looking for, knowing how much you want to pay, knowing and trusting the auction house and their descriptions and their values of the items. How do you go about evaluating, let's just take that last one, like an auction house, and they're, that's a good auction house for me to maybe look at for buying from, or that one maybe not so much. What are kind of the things that you think the collector should be thinking about when they're evaluating?
Yeah, I think the level of description is useful. Being able to, if you're looking at, say, first editions of a particular author with particular points to do with, say, the dust jacket. Let's say you're interested let's say your collection is focused particularly on condition. You're very much focused on that. You're keeping an eye on some of the points that are being described. And if those aren't there, if you have to start asking, that's a thing you got to be aware of. It might be something that they just missed because they're having to process 300 lots for that upcoming sale and it was just a mistake. Or it might be something else, so you want to get in touch with them. If they're responsive, I think that's always a great thing. That's always a good sign. If they're able to take provide photographs of details of, say, particular condition. If they're saying shelfware, if you can request a photograph of that, seeing if they're able to provide that information, I think really sets up a nice start. So in that matter, I think it is important that as soon as the catalogs are available of an auction house that you start to sort of like what they're offering and you're interested in their process, to get in touch with them earlier rather than later. I think there's often the scenario where the 11th hour, just before the auction, you're getting requests to look at particular condition reports. It helps to provide the specialist with as much time as possible to provide you the demonstrative information to make those educated decisions as to if this object, if this item aligns nicely with the objectives and focuses of my collecting practice.
Yeah.
So I think that that's an important thing to look at. And then look at third-party aggregators. You think of something like Rare Book Hub or Art Price or some of the other ones that are available, and take a look at if this auction house has provided this material before. Are there other auction houses that have offered it? What are the differences in the estimates? When was the last time they did this? Start to chart those projections, right? There may be very much a fluctuation or a change in the pricing. Start to look into what's the difference. What this item is different somehow, or it may not be. So have a look at what was the circumstances for that auction event. I think that's something I talk about when I'm analyzing auction scenarios for clients to prepare to bid for materials. I often like to kind of look at it as auction events, as discrete events. Like, what are some of the conditions that we can determine as to why that item, resulted in that price? So give yourself that time to start to see the patterns, start to look at the data, start to think about, is this going in your favor? Is this something that you're comfortable in participating in? Because you're right, this discussion about it's commonly referred to as auction fever, right? And there have been a number of papers, mostly through kind of Dutch economists and German economists, who talk about the kind of psychological effects of the auction environment. And so there are a number of kind of theories there. But one of them that's quite telling is that there's this thought that you start to sink the costs of your collection into the particular item that you are desiring within the auction event. And let's say hypothetically you purchase that item and it's off, or that you were not, you started to look at it as more valuable than what you ought to have paid for it. It can be quite corrosive to looking at your general collection, because you start to look at the rest of the collection as the reason you purchased that piece, and that piece is off. It's something that's hard to come to terms with, but certainly can happen in the auction event. And so it is important to, have the data prior to, and think about, when I'm in this scenario, does my heart quicken? Do I start to make decisions that are against my better judgment given the data? There are options to do absentee bids and stay away from it, or have someone involved who can mitigate that unpleasant experience. There are ways to think about it, but certainly clients that I've worked with in the past, prior to working with them, they discuss this idea of the kind of the event itself being quite overwhelming, and being surprised by that feeling. I think that that's totally legitimate. What was your experience? How did you feel through it?
I felt overwhelmed, a little nervous, about it. I think what you're saying is what I probably didn't do enough of my research. I mean, I knew what I was looking for and what I wanted, and I had looked at the catalog of what was available. So I was able to just say, I'm interested in this lot, that lot, and that lot. And here's kind of how much I think, how much I really want it and how much I would pay for it. And, I did look at the conditions, but as it's happening and they're moving from lot to lot, and you see, bids go up and things change, it's a little overwhelming. Yeah. The second and third time I did it was less so, but especially that first time, I was like, oh my God, I'm sweating. I can't deal with this kind of thing. And I think what you're saying is you need to put in that front end work, right? That time to look at what's available, look into the auction house, analyze the data, which, I think you've said a couple of times now, about, the prices that are offered, the values, all that kind of stuff. And in a way that makes auctions, not for the faint of heart. Well, you said that too, right? There are risks to participating. You buy not the right thing, I think is what you said. You end up buying something that's not quite the right thing for your collection, and where you pay not the right price for your collection, or for your item. So I think for me, pulling the trigger to participate was a whole thing. It was definitely an issue. We didn't really talk about this, and we're at the top of the hour, but there's two other things I want to make sure we talk a little bit about for the folks who are still here is the ways that people can participate in auctions, online auctions or in-person auctions are some of the same things. You've mentioned them, absentee or phone. Can you, tell us specifically what those are so people don't feel like it has to be all them sitting in the room raising a paddle or at a computer, hitting the button.
Yeah. So, the traditional paddle auction, you can register prior to the day or you register just before it takes place. In some cases, if it's quite a more established house or one that's maybe an auction scenario where there are more valuable materials, you may have to provide sort of financial information that can depend on the auction house, what that may be. So there's that scenario. There's the online situation. You can bid, by clicking away and being somehow cyber present, say on the event or on the day, where there's usually a webcam that's in the room, and you can watch it online. And that's interesting. It's kind of changed the in-room auction event because there's somewhat of a lag. So sometimes there are these situations where you'll see the auctioneer waiting for online, and that changes things. So, there are scenarios where I've had clients who are putting bids in and it takes a moment for it to be acknowledged by the auctioneer. So if you're doing that process, I think it is important to kind of, give yourself some time there to know that there may be a lag. There's then the absentee bid, which you can lock that in and it becomes something that's adjusted as people counter bid. So you may be it kind of moves through, but you cannot be, that allows you for somewhat of a distance to that process. You set up where you want to get to. You're at say 4,500, and that's as far as you want to go on that. I think also factor in the buyer's premium obviously in that limit as well. And I think that's a good option for people that find it somewhat overwhelming. And if they've done the research and think that's the cap. And then, telephone bids. Telephone bids are another scenario where some people like that because they can, it's almost like a hybrid, say, of doing the digital situation, because but the lag is gone. However, you're also connected, like you're similarly in the room. I've had situations where, dealing with clients who feel that overwhelming feeling of being in the auction event, even though they're on the phone. And then sometimes even more extreme because they're hearing it through, someone who works for the auction house who's just telling them what's happening, right? So there's even a kind of distance there. So some people like that because it has a certain amount of distance to it, and it allows them to be tuned into the room in real time.
Yeah.
And so I think those are kind of the major ones that you find. The kind of online scenario of a timed auction, say one where they're offering materials for 3 days or something like that, that's kind of a whole other kettle of fish. You typically lock in a bid and you go from there. And sometimes you'll find that you lock in a bid and there's someone who's got it set up so it counters. That one's a little bit more out of your control.
I think people have told me or expressed concern to me, and even I think in the chat about like, is that risky, right? To set your upper limit, whether it's in an absentee bid or an online thing, that it just artificially gets bid up to your limit, or does that happen? Should people be worried about that?
Yeah, that's something I'm kind of looking into actually right now. How to determine that, how to understand that. I think when you're dealing with, I think if you've done the research of the material and within a broad spectrum of its appearances through the market, if you're seeing material that's going above it, that's what you were willing and comfortable to provide to allocate your resources for. So it's kind of a sidestepping of your question,
Yeah, yeah.
it is an important one, but it's one that, the channels through which I'm operating with clients is mostly auction houses. I'm not doing a lot of, but it is something that I'm also starting to engage with more, and starting to try and understand that. I haven't seen such value fluctuations that it's way inflated though. So things seem to be consistently connecting with, something that's like a digital auction platform where it's not an auctioneer, but it's timed. I'm seeing results that are consistent with that of a live auction setting.
Oh, okay. So
when
maybe
you start to see that separation, I think that's probably somewhere where you start to get concerned or start to ask questions about that. But that's something I think that's going to be an ongoing conversation, because I feel that the auction platform is going to provide third-party service more than less as we continue on in this new kind of collecting environment. So, yeah.
Well, there must be some backup, some data that actually can be reviewed, right, or audited to show that there were, intermediate bids that bid up. It's not gonna. I think people's concerns are like, the most I'll pay is $4,000, so it's at 2 now, and then it's at 2,100. Right. And then suddenly you're paying $4,000. I think people are worried about that. Is that true, that there are really those bids in there and they're not just taking your top?
One thing I would say is that I'm quite confident that there's a lot of conversation online about the experiences of online auctioning. And it's one of those things that the platform that's providing the service is successful if people feel that they're in a trusted situation.
Yeah.
And it's the type of thing that if enough people notice like that this is off, something's off here, that could be detrimental to that platform, to the buyers in that scenario. So I would hope to think that, I'm keeping an eye on some of those comments, and it seems like there's quite a rich conversation that's happening through through various listservs and discussions about that activity. So
I think if people feel they're being taken advantage of, they're not going to remain silent, right?
No.
They're going to press charges, all right? They'll cause some kind of investigation, and if there is something wrong, it will come out. So I think you're right. It is kind of about trust. If they feel like it's working the way it should be working and they're not being taken advantage of, then things are good, right?
And this is something that you'll start to, that's something you're considering in that process of participating as a buyer. I think it is that if something's giving you that feeling, follow it. I think it's important to consider that stuff, above and beyond your considerations of building your collection. You want to feel safe and comfortable in developing that collection.
So there is a question that came up in one of the chat or the Q&A, and one that I've been thinking of as well, which is like, what is really going gangbusters in these online auctions? Is there a certain genre or type, first edition, signed, biography? Like what has really kind of, broken through in this new world?
I mean, that's a good question. I think a lot of the time I'm engaged in these environments to analyze auction results and performance for collectors that are purchasing material. So I'm kind of there on the interests of collectors who are going to be participating in auctions. I think one of the things I'm just noticing is there's a increase in visual material. I think a lot of the visual ephemera, poster, photography material is doing well, and there's really an engagement and interest in that. Certain political activist movements and the posters that are that are associated with them are starting to become, valuable and desirable for people to collect and develop in their collections. So I think that material. Um, I'm also just seeing like I am seeing manuscript material, like early manuscript material is the descriptions, the catalog descriptions are getting so good with the precision on it that I think people are starting to collect that more. I'm seeing continued interest in that, but it's sort of hard for me to say what's the general themes that are going on. I'm just I think there's other stuff like science is happening in a kind of big way. I think that a lot of kind of to add on to the talk from a couple of weeks ago about collecting in the time of COVID, I think it's increased people's awareness of the developments of scientific discovery. At least colleagues of mine are saying that younger people are bidding on this material very specifically. Obviously, some of your listeners will, say like, yeah, the history of medicine is like, it's a very well-established collecting field for sure. It's also a period of time that right now, demographically speaking, there's quite a bit of that material that's starting to be offered through the market, and there's younger people who are interested in it. Polar exploration is becoming a big thing. As the climate crisis continues, there is interest in that research, in sea navigation. As discussions of colonial issues continue to come to the fore, there's discussions about early contact descriptions. So there is very much a kind of historiography that I think is becoming just generally of interest. And what's interesting about that is that it crosses over on certain collecting subject topics that for maybe the last little while had not been, had maybe plateaued for a period of time. So you're seeing an activity there that, to answer your question, it's not that it's going gangbusters, it's just that the estimates of those values are kind of holding, and there's maybe some increase of competition of people who are interested in that material. And I think just generally association copies are becoming much more of interest in a lot of different ways. So I think those will always find very avid collectors of a particular individual. So I think those are continuing as well. But
yeah, you actually answered one of the late breaking questions on here about current events and influencing auctions. Like when an author dies, does their stuff come up more frequently and higher prices? But you mentioned world events, right? The COVID era and the polar exploration and global warming. So I think maybe even in a way, some of these online auctions can be a little bit more timely in terms of pulling stuff together, marketing it, and launching an event than maybe the old school brick and mortar auction house can be.
It's a real thing. I mean, there's so much content out there. It's continuing. There's more content. People are becoming more interested in it. You watch even the behavior of like Hemingway related material, which has in more or less a way kind of established itself. It's very much set up. And, even with the emergence of, I'm sure listeners watched the Ken Burns special that was set up over the summer, that increased engagement in Hemingway material. It's just something that happens. And we're coming into a lot of anniversaries. We're also coming into a lot of, I think people are becoming more conscious of just primary source documents and connecting with that material. I think that's very much for the clients I work with, that's becoming a major impetus and a thought of almost being a custodian of those stories. I think that's just happening in a different way. It's almost like an activist form of collecting. And I think that's going to continue. There's going to be more of that, not less. Back to that discussion of collecting from the last presentation of like idea-oriented collecting, it seems to be very much taking place. So
So do you think you mentioned earlier on specifically the migration of fair and catalog collectors to auctions? Do you think that's going to be a permanent shift? How strongly is that going to take hold? And you mentioned it was transformative. It was a big change that it's happening. Do you think it's sustainable? You think it's going to be a long-term thing, or will it balance back
Yeah,
out? Like,
I think that it's not that they're just going right to auctions only. It's not that they're totally shifting over.
right.
That maybe they stayed in one lane, one channel for a period of time. They were just looking at particular catalogs, and they started to look over there, and now that's
That's
in
part
the
of the mix.
that's
Yeah.
in the mix. That's in the mix.
Yeah.
And so that's what I mean by that. It's there's certainly a conversion happening there. There's some, there's clients I work with who are committed auction goers. They're interested more in that environment than trade. So and they're going along like it was, this what they were purchasing in lockdown was they were seeing great stuff being offered, and it was just continuing. It was business as usual.
Yeah.
And then you had other collectors that were starting to go, oh, there is material over there, and they moved over. So it's not that you're losing people involved in catalog and fair centric environments. It's just that they're starting to engage too. It might waver. We may lose. People may come back to fairs as well. I certainly think that fairs are going to continue to be really a successful, exciting scenario. It's very interesting to see the hybrids that take place as virtual fairs land back into, the London Fair, the New York Fair, Pasadena, California Book Fair. How that's going to play out. It will be interesting to see. So
Yeah, well, I know a lot of people are looking forward to the both, right? In live fairs, attending with some kind of online component for the stuff, because book dealers have to bring all those books to the fair. So there's only so many books some dealers can bring. This way, they could actually offer so much more with some virtual component for each fair. So I think it's a win-win, I think, for both when we're back to live fairs with
yeah. Absolutely. And again, I think it also is going to be an option. The auction system is going to be an option that a later demographic of booksellers are going to start considering, because you don't have to take on the added risk of an inventory. I think that's going to be something that takes place.
Yeah.
So that I'm continuing to keep an eye on. So
we might have to have you back in a year or so to recap, see where we are, see how things have changed from what we're talking about tonight.
I'd be delighted. It'd be great.
Yeah. You know what? I think now would be a great time to pull your last slide back up there. So people who might want to grab your email or your phone number and your name and all that jazz can get it as we wrap up here, because it's definitely after 6:15 and we should be wrapping up.
Right.
We still got a lot of people still here interested in all of this great stuff. And as usual, I will give you all of these kind of questions in the chat and the Q&A so you can look at them and answer them. There are a couple questions about what exactly do you do for your clients? And I'd love for you to be able to answer that for folks directly. Yeah. So we definitely want to put you in touch with them to do that.
Yeah, that'd be great.
Yeah, but for now, we're just going to say thank you so much. This was such a great conversation. I'm glad we had a lot of time to actually talk more about it. Unless, the presentation part was great, but I think the conversation part was really helpful as well. So thank you for that. So, and thank you to everyone for attending this Book Club of California program. If you're still with us, I'm glad you stayed to the end here. And maybe some of you will come down with auction fever, as Spencer shared with us. Maybe you'll come down with auction fever after this great presentation. Hope you'll join us for our next online program. It's titled Iron Women, the Ladies Who Helped Build the Railroad, on Monday, July 19th. So that's a week from tonight, from 5 to 6:15 p.m. here on Zoom. That's just, again, 1 week away. We're back to our weekly programs. This will be a live online presentation by author and a screenwriter named Chris Enns, who's written a number of books on women and the Old West. You can register for this event online at bccbooks.org/programs, or using the link in the weekly programs emails that you may be receiving from the book club. So again, thanks everyone for attending. Thank you, Spencer. This was great.
Thank you, Kevin.
I hope everyone has a wonderful evening. Be well and take care of yourself. Thanks.